And thank you to the Big Ideas Festival team and to Sheila for the invitation to talk today. And it's a genuine privilege to be here in my hometown to talk to you, and thank you for giving up your afternoon in the sun on the beach to listen to me drone on about history. As Kane said, I'm Scarborough born and bred, so I'm very proud to be a Scarboroughian. I'm less so proud of the Scarborough Council, which I can take that offline. And this is the first talk I've ever done where I've had to compete with seagulls. So I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes or so, and hopefully we'll have a few minutes for a question and answer session at the end. And as Kane mentioned, I'm a former Royal Marine Commando, and I'm very proud of that. In fact, I cut my cloth in terms of the understanding of beach reconnaissance and the techniques used on the South Bay. We've stopped. There we go. The experience gleaned in the 1970s never went astray, unfortunately. So, the Big Ideas Festival is very much about individuals with some interesting stories to tell. I've had quite an interesting life. I can't compete with the likes of Alan Hinks in terms of his mountaineering adventures. But, oops. These are just a few highlights of my life to date. During the 1990s, I trained with the Royal Marines, as you've heard. I went off to various places, and including kayaking the Okavango Delta in Botswana. I was a mountaineer and climber across Europe, North America and Africa. Research expedition in the Solomon Islands, 1995-1996, chasing extinct bats, which was fascinating, living with Stone Age tribes. But by far, the biggest challenge I've ever had to deal with was in 2000. I had a commission with the RAF and unfortunately had a car crash, and as a result I was paralysed for the rest of my life and changed my whole perspective on the world. So to give something back, top left, I decided to participate in a project to circumnavigate Britain to recruit blood donors for the National Blood Service. Something I was very passionate about. I was very lucky to live. I nearly died 3 times, and I had 20 units of blood. So this was my give back, and we managed to recruit 100,000 blood donors and raise about £15,000 for the poppy appeal, and I loved it because I was cycling every day. So, as Kay mentioned, I joined GCHQ in 2002, just after the bike ride. So I've been part of the organisation for 20 years, and in the last 2 years I've been very lucky to have one of the best jobs in the country, which is to be the department's historian of an organisation I'm very proud of. The signals intelligence, which is the mainstay of what I'm going to talk to you about, is quite a complex business. And the basis of it is this: it's the intelligence cycle. You start with the requirements, which are typically from Whitehall or from the military or even from international partners. Then you go into the collection phase, which is where sites like Scarborough come into play with collecting the signals. Those signals have to be processed by very sophisticated machines and computers. The data is then analysed and production goes on, which essentially reports that are of intelligence value will be presented back to the customers. So the reports are disseminated and you get feedback. So it's a fairly simplistic way of looking at a very, very complex process. But I'm trying to sort of instill a degree of knowledge because it's a complex business. Now, I obviously can't go into classified territory in this talk. Everything I'm telling you is unclassified. So if you're interested in any state secrets, you'll have to come and take my thumbnails out. But we will be talking a bit about Bletchley Park, but my majority of the talk will be talking about Scarborough's history, which is why I'm here. Scarborough has the honour of having the oldest continually operated signals collection site in the world. and you should be very proud of that. Signals intelligence, or SIGINT, came of age at the beginning of the First World War, and the development of the pioneering interception site in Scarborough put the Royal Navy on a sure footing for monitoring the German high seas fleet for the rest of the First World War. The insights gained helped give the British an edge. The Royal Navy established a wireless telegraphy station in Scarborough as far back as 1912. The land was actually purchased by the Admiralty in 1911, but SIGINT, Signals Intelligence, didn't start until 1914 in support of the defence of Britain and our armed forces. The site formed part of a small parcel of land purchased by the Admiralty and would grow to accommodate several large aerial towers, a station commander's house known as the Cottage, and various outbuildings. The Cottage, which is still there today in Sandybed Lane, had ground floor rooms where radio operators worked and was located within a secure fence patrolled by armed guards. It was originally designed, as I mentioned, for Royal Navy radio communications, not for intercept. But it had about 25 radio specialists and over 100 operators during the First World War as the value of interception grew. Enciphered German naval messages intercepted at the station were sent from the site to Room 40, which was the Admiralty's small crypt analysis section in London. This was long before Bletchley Park ever existed. And the picture I just showed you was the doorbell from the Cottage, which is now in the Sites Museum in Scarborough. Signals intelligence was not developed sufficiently at the site to prevent the bombardment of Scarborough, Hartlepool and Whitby on the 16th of December 1914, which was intended to terrorise the British population and was not, as some believe, due to the presence of an Admiralty SIGINT site in Scarborough. The land on Irton Moor was used at the time as a camp for the 5th Battalion, the West Yorkshire Regiment. And the cessation of hostilities in 1918, Scarborough's mission widened to include diplomatic communications, with resources eventually being evenly split between naval and diplomatic intercepts. On the 22nd of March 1922, the Raincliffe estate was sold at auction. And you can see the small plot here, which is Lot 5, was sold and purchased by the Crown and acquired by the Admiralty, and became the site where the organisation is now located. It encompassed approximately 100 acres of what originally had been part of the Scarborough Racecourse. Lord Lunsborough, who owned the land, gave his consent for the land to be used as a volunteer encampment for the 1st Lancashire Rifle Volunteers. In 1932, a proposal was made to close Scarborough and transfer operations. And transfer operations to Flowerdown site in Hampshire. The decision was reversed, and in 1935, the interception of the German Navy was restarted at Sandybed Lane, just in time for the build-up of the Spanish Civil War. Lieutenant Commander Jock Roger was assigned as the officer in charge of Scarborough in January 1934, and he referred to the site famously as the Cinderella, with just 25 staff. The interception and electrical equipment, quote, could only be classed as junk, and my operators were of the opinion that the material read was destined for the waste paper basket. Hope things have improved since. World events including Hitler's accession to power in Germany, the Japanese seizure of Manchuria, the Spanish Civil War, and Mussolini's Abyssinian conquest brought about an increasing need for signals intelligence for the British government and armed forces. The threat of sanctions against Italy in the Mediterranean triggered changes to the Scarborough site during this interwar period, and a proper wireless telegraphy room with 7 receiving bays were built at a cost of £800, fitted out with the latest receiver equipment. Additional teleprinter lines to the Government Code and Cipher School and the Admiralty in London were also installed to aid the rapid dissemination of SIGINT to where it was most needed. The Munich crisis in September 1938, Scarborough got an additional 20 Royal Navy ratings and a Chief Petty Officer telegraphist from Devonport, alongside 5 Admiralty Civilian Shore Wireless Service operators. In Christmas 1938, these additional staff returned to Devonport, reducing the personnel down to 30 ratings, 1 civilian typist and the officer in charge. As war loomed, the site needed to rapidly expand its personnel and equipment, and a batch of retired Admiralty civilian shore wireless service staff were given the opportunity to return, and about 15 did, which would be the nucleus of the more experienced operators at the station during the Second World War. Sandybed Lane upgraded beyond recognition to meet the increasing demands from the military. The new aerials were erected. And under Lieutenant Commander Rogers' tenure, the site expanded from 1¼ acres and 25 naval staff to 230 acres and 680 civilian, naval and RENS personnel. Roger would lead the site for 10 years and would play an active part in the development of the Admiralty's direction finding, or DF, during the entire war. A lot of you will be familiar with the story behind Bletchley Park. We can't talk about Second World War SIGINT without talking about Bletchley Park. If you've never been to the museum, do put it on your radar when COVID's sorted out, because it's a fabulous museum, in fact one of the nation's finest. So our predecessor organisation, the Government Code and Cipher School, moved into Bletchley on the 15th of August 1939 with just 180 staff. So this was a small crypt analytic office. They were used to breaking codes and ciphers, that's what they did. But over the course of the Second World War, it transformed the organisation to what we now know as GCHQ. We were using the phrase GCHQ as a cover term during the Second World War at Bletchley, and it stuck when we left. But we became and introduced machinery to break very complex ciphers used by the German Enigma and the German Lorenz cipher machines. And at the height of the war, there were over 10,000 people working at Bletchley Park. 76% of them were women. Roughly 300 were just doing code breaking. So when you watch the Hollywood films, it's a much bigger story. In fact, the site, and one of the most important stories of GCHQ's history, is about the birth of computing, which happened here in Bletchley Park in 1943. A chap called Max Newman, Dr. Max Newman, who you may never have heard of, was a maths lecturer at St John's College in Cambridge. He was actually Alan Turing's lecturer during the 1930s, and when he was recruited by Bletchley Park, he was tasked with setting up a research section which took his name, which became the Newman Ring. And he was tasked with breaking the Lorenz cipher. The Lorenz machine was a whole new ballgame in comparison to the Enigma. It had 12 rotors. It was about 4 times the size of an Enigma machine and used by the German High Command in occupied Europe. So the key strategic messages of Hitler and his highest ranking generals was the target. In March 1943, Max Newman wrote the first computer specification document in the world, tasking the post office research station at Dollis Hill with the building of the first computer, which became known as Colossus. It took 10 months to build. It was installed in Bletchley Park by a team of engineers under the leadership of Tommy Flowers, and could run at 2,500 characters a second. It was still classified until the early 2000s. 10 of these machines were built during the Second World War, and they were all destroyed at the end of the Second World War, bar 2, which became known as Blue and Red. And they were moved to Eastcote in 1946 when the organisation moved to Eastcote. And subsequently, in the early 50s, when we moved to Cheltenham, the Blue and Red computers were taken there and still used until the early 60s. They've been written out of the history of computing because they were still classified. But it's a story I'm very proud of, and everybody at GCHQ is. Britain was preparing for war at the end of 1938. The Admiralty site in Scarborough was now linked to a wide DF network around the country, and then was also connected by a teleprinter to Bletchley Park. The Admiralty high-frequency radio DF network would prove to be vital in the protracted war of the Battle of the Atlantic. Many Allied convoys would owe their survival to it. In August 1939, the Y service ramped up for war. No further development was possible at Sandybed Lane, so the Admiralty was given permission to build a new wireless collection site on Irton Moor. But they weren't moved until the 1st of March 1943. The staff were a mix of civilian and service personnel, mostly drawn from the Women's Royal Navy Service, or WRENS, and the site had a familiar name of HMS Paragon. The Wren, Joan Sprinks, was quoted with saying, "We were given brass buttons and rated as chief wrens so as to be equal in status to the civilian men. At Scarborough we were billeted in boarding houses and walked or cycled to go and watch in a room that was below ground. The night watch took a lot of getting used to. From 11:30 at night to 8 o'clock in the morning, sitting at a bench with a number of ex-Navy personnel who all seemed to consume very strong tea and to smoke endless ticklers, which were hand-rolled with very strong Navy-issued tobacco. There was no fresh air at all, although the watchroom was occupied for the whole of the 24 hours, and in addition, there was of course a total blackout. Everything was so secret that we were trusted not to breathe a word about the work we were doing, which was intercepting the messages of German ships." After Scarborough, Sprinks deployed as an intercept operator overseas and went to Singapore, Mombasa and Colombo at the GC&CS outpost, which was known as the Far East Combined Bureau. Another story from the Second World War, which is an important part of our history, is the signing of Yakuza, our bilateral partnership with the Americans, which was forged on the 5th of March 1946. We celebrated the 75th anniversary this year. Signed in Washington. And the basis of that relationship, that partnership, was developed from an American delegation which became known as the Sinkoff Mission, led by US Army officer Abraham Sinkoff, who were invited to Bletchley Park in February 1941. And the Americans stayed for a number of weeks and shared with us their knowledge of the Japanese cipher systems at play. And we exposed for the first time the work we were doing on German Enigma cipher and the development of the electromechanical bomb machines that were the basis of our decryption process. Two of that four-man delegation, US naval officers Robert Weeks and Prescott Currier, made a number of visits to other sites around the country, including 2 days at Scarborough. They were escorted throughout by Captain Humphrey Sandwith, who was the Deputy Director Signals Division of the Y Service, the main man responsible for Royal Navy Y Service collection. And they were tasked with finding out more about the high-frequency radio DF system that we'd developed. Currier and Weeks got tours of the operational areas and were briefed on Scarborough's intercept methods and equipment layout. The main role during this period was the interception of German Navy and naval air communications, alongside the control of its direction-finding network. From 1940 onwards, the site was also home to a small RAF SIGINT unit. During May 1941, Scarborough played a key role in the location and subsequent destruction of the German battleship, the Bismarck. One Royal Navy intercept operator working on the Bismarck traffic was Raymond Whittaker. He intercepted the final message from Admiral Lutyens on board the Bismarck to German naval headquarters in Paris on the 25th of May 1941. Although Bletchley Park hadn't decrypted the message, the DF control at Scarborough was able to plot the target. This enabled the Royal Navy to deploy a Catalina flying boat to locate the Bismarck, which led to its subsequent sinking on the 27th of May 1941. The Bismarck was located from SIGINT clues from a number of sites, but the confirmation that she was making for the west coast of France, as she came from non-naval Enigma signals sent to satisfy the anxiety of an inquirer in Athens. In June and July, the German naval Enigma traffic became readable for the first time. The Allies concentrated on the sinking of tankers and supply ships stationed in the Atlantic, used to refuel the ships like the Bismarck, the Prince Eugen, and U-boats. Rosemary Lister, the WRENS operator, arrived at site in April 1940 after 3 months of intensive wireless training in London. She recounted her experiences of working at the site in the early part of the Second World War. I was mainly dealing with broadcast signals which the Germans sent from their coastal bases on the French coast to their vessels in the Atlantic, the Norwegian coast, and to the shipping in the North Sea. The broadcasts would come up to known to us frequencies at 10 minutes past the hour, long messages of 4-letter groups. If bearings were obtained, these would be reported to Scarborough Control, and these bearings would be reported by telephone to the duty officer at the Admiralty. But the sinking of the Bismarck was the first time staff, both at Scarborough and at Bletchley Park, felt they were making a significant contribution to the war. Although the result was traffic analysis rather than cryptanalysis, it was an important moment both at Bletchley Park and for national morale. In August 1941, an armed merchant vessel, the SS Aguila, was loaded in Liverpool with cargo and 86 Royal Navy personnel and 6 civilian passengers bound for Gibraltar. The Royal Navy personnel were Wrens who had volunteered for duty in Gibraltar, 12 as cipher officers and 9 as wireless operators. 12 of these ladies had been based in Scarborough. Aguila was one of 23 merchant ships that formed convoy OG 71, which left Liverpool on the 13th of August, under the Aguila's master Arthur Firth being at the helm. On the 17th of August, a German aircraft spotted the convoy, and the next day it was attacked by a U-boat Wolfpack. One of the U-boats, U-201, fired 2 torpedoes, which hit the side housing the Wren's cabins and sank the Aguila at 03:10 in the morning on the 19th of August. The sinking of the Aguila would leave 145 dead and 16 survivors. But after the sinking, the Royal Navy stopped using civilian ships to carry its personnel. The press at the time focused on the loss of 21 Wrens, and the other Wrens across the country donated a day's pay for a new memorial fund, and some of that money was donated to the RNLI. And in 1951, a new Liverpool-class lifeboat, the Aguila Wren, was launched in their honour in Aberystwyth on the 28th of June that year. That lifeboat served until 1964, and it was then relocated to Redcar, where it saw service from 1964 to 1972. The Aguila Wren lifeboat was called out 74 times in its service and saved the lives of 38 people, a fitting tribute to the loss of the Navy Wrens. Some money was paid for a new sick bay on a naval escort sloop, HMS Wren, but the lost members of the Aguila's crew were commemorated in the Merchant Navy's War Memorial at Tower Hill in London. The National Memorial Arboretum now has an Aguila Memorial, which is a giant wren on a granite obelisk dedicated to the 21 wrens that were lost. And I believe in July 1972, a memorial bench was committed by the Lighthouse Pier in the South Bay. 60 staff were on a watch at any one time during the Second World War, mostly consisting of men during that nighttime shift, and the Royal Navy operators as well were billeted typically in private houses in the town. Wren operators manned 2 watches, and they were accommodated at the Cecil Hotel and at the Chatsworth Hotel on the Crescent, and they were bussed up to the Irton Moor site every day. The civilians and the sailors kept 3 watches, 2 weeks on day duties, 1 week on night duty, and the Wrens maintained 4 watches, which operated from 7 o'clock in the morning to 12 o'clock, and then 12 o'clock till 5 p.m, alternate days for 3 weeks, then 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. each night for 1 week. The mainstay of the site at the time was the bunker. This was a receiver room where operators would be allocated typically 1 frequency to monitor. Some, very occasionally, were given 2 frequencies to monitor. And the text of intercepted German messages were usually intercepted in 4-letter code groups, but sometimes in 5-figure code groups. The frequency would be given out by a special operator on a high rostrum in the centre of the receiving room and then passed to the DF team for tracing. It was a seamless process. German U-boats and surface ships typically operated in the high-frequency radio bands, and they originated from 3 main broadcast stations: Berlin, Paris and Lorient. There was a 4th station on the German coast near Emden, which broadcast weather reports, which was also significant. If a U-boat wanted to transmit messages on these frequencies, it needed to come to the surface, which would give the DF teams at Scarborough the opportunity to get positional fixes. The U-boats were obliged to acknowledge receipt of a radio message. Allied ship sightings and also relay weather reports, which gave the naval operators further opportunity to intercept the traffic and get locational information. The Supreme Commander of the German Navy, Admiral Karl Donitz, told his U-boat commanders that they could not be located if they limited their wireless transmissions to under 30 seconds. But skilled DF operators at site were able to locate the origin of their signals in as little as 6 seconds. During one period of World War II, the number of individual DF bearings dealt with daily in Scarborough was around 85, sometimes hitting a peak of 120 bearings a day. I mentioned the Royal Navy maintained a DF network, and at the height of the war there were 20 of these DF stations around the country, as far afield as Cooling Marshes, Cupar, the Shetlands, Wick, Winchester, Scarborough and St Just down in Cornwall. It also had a global DF network in places like Gibraltar, Accra and Ghana, Tristan da Cunha and St Helena. The main bunker contained the watch room, which was fitted with 60 Morse positions. The wireless receivers used at the time were the AR-88LF receivers. Some American-built 9-tube HRO shortwave receivers were also used. And what's often not talked about is the site in Sneinton, just 9 miles west of Scarborough, which was used as a contingency site for Irton Moor, in case Irton Moor came under attack by German bombers. The original complex at Sneinton had a number of small wooden huts, but all that's left today is the village hall, and I believe that photograph is in the village hall. The training of intercept operators for duties in Scarborough is also concentrated at this contingency site in Sneinton, and it's been estimated approximately 2,500 personnel were trained there during the Second World War, which included operators from Poland, Canada and the US. One Wren operator who monitored German U-boat traffic, Patricia Davis, recalled, "I always remember Scarborough because it was the spring of 1943 when the Atlantic convoys were having a terrible time with a lot of sinkings. You were very, very aware how crucial that work was. We were taken out by bus to Scarborough Racecourse because the listening station was underneath the racecourse in a sort of very long hangar with a large number of people in it. If you got a ship up, there was always more than one of us in the watch room. You wrote down the message completely to the end. One of the girls would then take it to the teleprinter in the room and teleprint it to Bletchley Park, so they got the coded messages immediately. If it was an operational message like motor torpedo boats preparing to attack our convoys or lay mines, then we would phone the nearest naval base as soon as we got the complete message. They would not be in code, so we would tell the base exactly what we'd heard." In May 1944, a senior official from Bletchley Park visited the station at Irton Moor and recalled, quote, "There is of course an air of tension in the set room, not to be found at stations of a less operational kind. The watch on U-boats means a great deal of skill and concentration, both in the actual picking up of the signal and in the quick transference of the signal to the DF networks. Activity by U-boat often lasts just for 1 minute, during which time the traffic has to be taken and the signal picked up by the DF stations for bearings. I was lucky enough to see both operations in progress, and the quickness of everyone was a delight to watch." In early 1942, the new intercept station at Scarborough was sanctioned, and plans were rapidly prepared, and the construction began on Irton Moor. The Marconi Company did the design and the install of the aerial system, and the Treasury made no objection to an expenditure of £52,000, which is the equivalent today of about £2 million. An extract from the review written by Jock Roger, who was the OIC in Scarborough at the time, on the 15th of November 1945. The old way station in Sandybed Lane was altered out of recognition to meet increasing demands in equipment and the need for more personnel and space, particularly necessary for aerials and the servicing of wireless telegraphy apparatus. Roger went on to say, "I have great regard for the old station, or to be more correct, for the personnel who manned it under the most difficult condition with minimum apparatus." As I mentioned, the 1st of March 1943, the intercept station moved from the original site in Sandybed Lane to the racecourse at Irton Moor. This happened in the middle of one of the shifts, and what was remarkable was the transfer occurred without any stoppage of interception cover or the passing of traffic to Bletchley Park. The OIC commented this was a feat of organised planning. A half-buried, bomb-proof bunker covered in hundreds of tons of earth served as the main building of the site. The working conditions in the bunker were far from ideal, as we've heard. Heating and water supplies were inadequate, and rainwater would often seep into the building. By 1945, the site manned some 150 intercept positions. From 1945, the station's task was a collection of Soviet armed forces communications. Scarborough became the main station for the interception of Russian naval high command traffic and naval merchant traffic of the Warsaw Pact. From the 1950s, it developed its own in-house reporting commitment. As the site became civilianised, it retained its naval SIGINT focus, and reporting was disseminated to the Royal Navy and foreign partners like the US National Security Agency. It was also the hub for controlling the NATO Eastern Atlantic Direction Finding Network, which was known as EATHLANT. And a new building was constructed on the site and completed in 1955. But few stories at the height of the Cold War really emphasised the importance of the strength of our bilateral partnership with our American partners, more so than the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962. American intelligence was very reliant at the time on imagery intelligence to gauge what the Soviets were doing with our surface-to-air missile systems on Cuban territory. US President John F. Kennedy was told on the 16th of October that the Soviet Union was secretly shipping medium-range ballistic missiles onto Cuban soil. And Kennedy, as you all know, opted for a naval blockade, which was announced on the evening of the 22nd of October. Some Soviet merchant vessels en route to the island, and the biggest question of the time was whether they would break through the blockade and lead us to World War III. Scarborough at the time, one of the mainstays of their work was low priority HF tasks, monitoring Soviet merchant shipping in the Northern Hemisphere. Ships very much like the one I've just showed you, the Soviet cargo ship, the Kisledovsk. That particular ship was instrumental in changing the outcome of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The report that was issued by Scarborough on the 24th of October 1962 reported the position of the ship northeast of where it had been 24 hours earlier, confirming it had discontinued its voyage and had turned back towards the Baltic. The next day, further SIGINT reports showed more ships, originally bound for Cuba, alter their course and return to their Soviet ports. GCHQ SIGINT came through to our American partners in the early hours of the 24th of October, and the NSA analyst, Juanita Moody, who received it, famously made a call direct to Adlai Stevenson, who was the then American ambassador to the UN, who was going to go to address the United Nations Security Council the next day. State Department officials refused the call. so she dialed the number for his hotel room and got him out of bed. It was to provide the first signs that a nuclear standoff was beginning to abate. A copy of the report was also sent to the White House Situation Room. Just 2 days after Kennedy announced the quarantine of Cuba, the report gave a glimmer of hope and provided the first indications that the crisis was not going to escalate. In 1965, it was agreed the station should be transferred to GCHQ, which formed the Composite Signals Organisation, or CSO, to unify a number of civilian stations subordinate to different ministries, and the station became CSOS, Irton Moor. Moor's search and development, or MSD, capability was developed from October 1968, and from the early 70s, Scarborough had computers installed to control banks of RACOL RA-17 receiver sets. These sets eliminated frequency drift and improved interception at high frequencies. But Morse was beginning to decline as a communications method, as automation was becoming the norm. The work on the present building, the main building at site, began in 1972, and the new building was opened in 1974. Scarborough famously had documented the worst working conditions of any GCHQ site. The site was underground, as I mentioned, with only the admin building and a few rooms above site. The site was cramped, it was cold, it was damp. One operator recalls when it rained, buckets were strategically placed throughout the operations area, often on top of the bank of sets you were operating. Canteen facilities were a cupboard shop run by one of the operators at his position. Each watch had a labourer assigned who made tea 3 times a day and brought it round on a trolley. During construction periods, a single-storey annex was added to the building to accommodate the Long-Range Technical Search, or LRTS, facility, which was transferred from the site in Culm Head in November 1974. The fall of the Iron Curtain in the early 1990s resulted in a reduction of the UK's signals interception missions from other stations at Cheadle and Culm Head were transferred to Scarborough in 1995 and 1998 respectively. In July 2001, the site was officially avowed and renamed GCHQ Scarborough. On the 30th of July 2014, His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales visited the site to celebrate its centenary year. Arriving via helicopter for the visit, he toured the site and its museum and met members of staff and unveiled a commemorative plaque on the inside of the main building. It's alleged to have been the first official royal visit to the site, although it has been rumoured King George VI paid a surprise visit during the Second World War to boost morale. The site now runs an educational outreach programme, engaging schools and colleges in the north to inspire the next generation into engineering and computing, which has been running for over 5 years now. The educational schemes run at GCHQ Scarborough include a partnership with local University Technical College for career development programme for year 12 and 13 students. We've also got a diversity development programme with Coventry University Scarborough, virtual work experience opportunities post-COVID, supporting children from low socio-economic backgrounds with the partnership with the University of Hull. And GCHQ Scarborough is looking to extend outreach activities into Tees Valley to attract more diverse recruitment pipelines and increase aspirations in that area to pursue careers with GCHQ. The site regularly partners with colleagues in the National Cybersecurity Centre, which was formed in 2016, and delivers the Cyber First Girls competition in North Yorkshire. In 2016, a new training and development centre called the Alan Turing Training and Innovation Centre, or ATIC, was built at the site in a £42 million investment in Scarborough, £30 million of which was dedicated to upgrading and reshaping the infrastructure at the site. The new facility was opened by GCHQ Director Robert Hannigan, who said, "Scarborough has long been critical to the delivery of our mission to keep Britain safe, and now it will become a training hub for people across the north, enabling students on schemes like our cyber summer schools the chance to learn from our world-class staff in state-of-the-art surroundings." After 104 years of male leadership, the site at Scarborough further transformed itself in 2018 with the appointment of its first OIC, who is sat here today. And Sheila done an outstanding job. Modern day efforts against terrorism and serious crime and the work that goes on at Scarborough has been and will continue to be at the forefront of our national security. So that's the end of my talk on Scarborough, but I just want to signpost a few things. If you're interested in the history of the organisation further, in the last 4 years we've been working with a Canadian academic called Professor John Ferris at the University of Calgary, who has written our first authorised history, which is published by Bloomsbury, available in paperback and hardback by all good online retailers. So organise that. And on the way out, we do have the short history of GCHQ Scarborough, which is available for sale. All proceeds are going to local charities, including St Catherine's Hospice. The irony is, when I was a young lad walking my dogs past the fence, I often wondered what went on behind the wire. And now I do, because I wrote the book. So please buy one on the way out. And you also might be interested to know, week beginning the 6th of September, my team are developing a new permanent exhibition at Scarborough Library, which is bubbling to life some of these stories about the history of GCHQ Scarborough. I think the official opening's penciled in as Thursday the 9th of September, having a dedicated family day on the 11th, which is a Saturday. And as I mentioned to a few of you before the talk, what's really interesting is the lack of knowledge I've been able to find about Sandy Bed Lane, and when COVID's hopefully abated, we'll be able to get into the Scarborough archives to find out a bit more about the early years, because I've been really scrabbling around to find information. But it's a fascinating story. Hopefully you've enjoyed the talk. Thank you for listening. And let's get to the beach.
Can I say, I think we might have a little bit of time for one or two questions,
Yep.
if there's time. So if anybody got any questions, please direct towards David, and David will shout out what the question is.
Yes, sir.
The military use of Moor probably has now declined so much, I imagine, with the onset of the new threats in terms of cyber security. Is that the case? That's one general sort of question. And the second part, which you may not be able to answer, is whether or not Moor played any part in the run-up to the Iraq War, gathering intelligence on Saddam Hussein's regime.
I certainly can't answer that second question, but the first question, certainly probably since the late 80s, early 90s, has been a steady decline in Scarborough's military personnel, like there has been at a lot of our sites, with the decline of the Cold War and the threat from the Soviet Union, and the basis of a fairly static military target. And a large, significant percentage of our work was dedicated to that Soviet threat. So certainly in recent years it has declined, but we still have a significant number of personnel from all three services, and now last year we established the National Cyber Force, the NCF, which is to put us on the front foot in terms of offensive cyber operations against our adversaries. That's the game we are now playing with the likes of Russia, China and Iran, and it's increasingly a requirement to train military personnel in the skills that a lot of the civilian staff have developed over the last few years, to give them the capabilities and skill sets they need. So I do think there's probably going to, obviously the military is declining in number, as we all know, in recent years, but the number of people, military personnel within SIGINT, we may well start to see an increase in terms of proportions. Any other questions?
Okay, well thank you very much. One more round of applause, and don't forget there's a book to be bought.